It all becomes ours eventually anyway, my daughter-in-law said with a smile she thought I wouldn't notice. And that was the moment I realized she had never been looking at me as family. She had been looking at me as an inheritance. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until recently, I believe the people closest to me loved me for who I was rather than what I had. Looking back now, I can see the signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. The comment happened on a quiet Sunday evening in early October. The air outside carried the first hint of fall, and the maple trees lining my street were beginning to turn shades of gold and crimson. I had spent the afternoon preparing dinner for my son Ryan and his wife Nicole. Family dinners had always mattered to me. Even after my husband passed away 7 years earlier, I continued the tradition. The dining room looked warm under the soft glow of the chandelier. The table was set with my best dishes, the same set my husband and I had purchased during our 25th wedding anniversary trip to Charleston. Every plate held a memory. Every chair held a story. Ryan arrived carrying a bottle of wine. Nicole followed behind him wearing a cream-colored sweater and an expression that seemed pleasant enough. We ate roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The conversation stayed light. Ryan talked about work. Nicole talked about a neighbor who was remodeling her kitchen. I listened and smiled. Everything felt normal. Then the subject shifted. Nicole casually asked whether I was still working with the same financial advisor. The question seemed innocent enough. I told her I was. She nodded thoughtfully before asking whether the stock market had affected my retirement accounts. Ryan barely looked up from his plate. I answered politely, though I found it odd. Nicole had always shown a surprising amount of interest in my finances. Over the years, she had asked about my investments, my property taxes, my insurance policies, and even my will. Each question had been wrapped in concern. Each one had sounded reasonable, at least at the time. Then Ryan mentioned that one of their friends was thinking about buying a larger house. Nicole laughed softly and reached for her glass. Honestly, she said, people worry too much about money. It all becomes ours eventually anyway. She said it lightly, almost like a joke. Ryan chuckled. I don't think he even understood what she had really said, but I heard it, every word. The room suddenly felt quieter. The clink of silverware seemed distant. I looked across the table at Nicole. She was smiling as she sipped her wine, completely comfortable, completely confident, as though the future she imagined was already guaranteed. I smiled back. I didn't argue. I didn't question her. I simply took another bite of dinner and let the conversation move on. But something had shifted inside me. Later that night, after they left, I stood alone in the kitchen holding a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock above the stove. I thought about every conversation Nicole and I had shared over the last decade. Questions about property values. Questions about savings accounts. Questions about beneficiaries. One by one, memories began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had never intended to solve. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder whether Nicole's interest had never been concern at all. Maybe it had always been calculation. Maybe she had been counting something long before I realized there was anything to count. I rinsed my cup, turned off the kitchen light, and headed upstairs. As I reached the top step, I paused and looked back into the darkness below. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear, not anger, clarity. And for the first time, I began paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things that I had ignored for years. It was surprising how quickly patterns emerged once I stopped making excuses for them. Nicole had always been skilled at presenting curiosity as concern. For a long time, I believed that was exactly what it was. After all, families talk about important things. Families help one another. Families plan for the future. At least that was what I had always believed. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in my home office, I came across a folder containing property tax statements from several years earlier. The sight of them brought back a memory. Nicole had once spent nearly 20 minutes asking detailed questions about the value of my house after noticing one of those statements on the kitchen counter. At the time, she had laughed and said she was simply interested in real estate. I remembered believing her. Then another memory surfaced. A Thanksgiving dinner about 4 years earlier. Nicole had asked whether I planned to keep the house forever or eventually downsize. When I told her I had not thought much about it, she seemed oddly disappointed. At the time, I assumed I was imagining things. Now I was not so sure. The memories kept coming. A conversation about retirement accounts. questions about beneficiaries, questions about life insurance policies, questions about whether I had updated my will after my husband passed away. None of those questions had seemed alarming on their own. Together, however, they formed a picture that was becoming difficult to ignore. One evening I sat alone on my back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air had grown cooler, and I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I thought about Ryan. That was the part that hurt the most. Nicole's interest in my finances was one thing. Ryan's silence was another. My son had always been kind. He was thoughtful as a child and hardworking as an adult. Yet over the years I had noticed subtle changes. He deferred to Nicole more often. He rarely questioned her opinions. Sometimes it felt as though he was avoiding uncomfortable truths because facing them would require difficult conversations. A few days later, Ryan stopped by after work. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Then he casually mentioned rising housing costs and how difficult it was for young families to get ahead. There was nothing unusual about the comment itself. What caught my attention was what came next. "Nicole says you have always been smart with money," he said. "She wishes more people planned ahead the way you did." I smiled politely. "That is kind of her to say." Ryan nodded. "She admires what you built." Built. Not earned. Not saved. Built. The choice of words lingered in my mind long after he left. That night, I opened an old photo album. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, anniversaries, and graduations filled the pages. Nicole appeared in many of them, smiling, laughing, standing beside Ryan, looking every bit like family. I studied those photographs carefully. Then I closed the album and placed it back on the shelf. Something inside me had changed. I was no longer looking backward with sentiment. I was looking backward for evidence. And with each passing day, I became more certain that Nicole's comment at dinner had not been a joke at all. It had been a glimpse of what she truly believed. The first real test came sooner than I expected. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Nicole called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded warm, almost cheerful. She asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything from the grocery store, and whether my arthritis had been bothering me with the colder weather. The concern sounded genuine. Years earlier, I would have appreciated it without a second thought. Now I listened more carefully. After several minutes of small talk, she arrived at the real reason for the call. She mentioned that her own parents were updating their estate planning documents. Then she casually asked whether I had reviewed mine recently. I stood by the kitchen window watching rain slide down the glass. "Not recently," I said. There was a brief pause, just long enough to notice. "You probably should," she replied. "Things change. It is important to keep everything organized." Organized. Another interesting choice of words. I thanked her for the advice and ended the call a few minutes later. Then I sat down at the table and wrote the date on a notepad. For the first time in my life, I was keeping track. Not because I wanted conflict, because I wanted clarity. Over the following days, similar moments continued to appear. Small moments, easy to dismiss if viewed separately, impossible to ignore when viewed together. During Sunday dinner, Nicole asked whether I still handled all of my investment accounts personally. Another time she asked whether online banking was becoming difficult for me. The question was delivered with a smile, but something about it lingered. I had managed my finances for decades. There had never been any sign that I needed assistance. Yet the subject kept returning. One evening, Ryan and Nicole invited me to their house. We sat on the back patio while the sun set behind the neighboring homes. The conversation drifted from vacations to retirement to future plans. Then Nicole brought up a friend whose elderly mother had given her son power of attorney. "It made things so much easier for everyone," she said. Ryan nodded. "Less stress, less paperwork." I looked at both of them. Neither appeared nervous. Neither appeared deceptive. In fact, that was what made the conversation unsettling. They seemed comfortable, as though they had already discussed the subject privately, as though they were gently introducing an idea they hoped would eventually become reality. I smiled and changed the subject. When I returned home later that night, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair. The house felt quiet, peaceful, yet my mind remained busy. I thought about my husband. He had always trusted his instincts when it came to people. More than once during our marriage, he had noticed things long before I did. "Pay attention to patterns," he used to say. "People reveal themselves through repetition." At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I realized the lesson applied everywhere. The next morning, I opened my calendar and marked several dates. Not because I had reached a conclusion, not because I had proof of anything, but because a pattern was forming, and for the first time I intended to follow it wherever it led. Whatever Nicole believed about my future, whatever expectations she carried behind those polite smiles, I was no longer willing to remain unaware. I had spent years assuming the best. Now I was finally paying attention to what was actually happening. About 2 weeks later, something happened that pushed my suspicions beyond intuition and into something much harder to dismiss. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had driven across town to pick up a prescription before stopping at a small bakery I liked near the town square. The place was quiet, with only a few customers sitting near the windows. I ordered a coffee and a blueberry muffin and found a table in the corner. I had barely taken my first sip when I heard a familiar voice. Nicole was sitting on the outdoor patio with a woman I recognized from one of her neighborhood social gatherings. They were separated from me by a large window. I could not hear everything they said, but certain words carried clearly enough. Retirement, property, estate, future. At first I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Then I saw Nicole pull out her phone. She showed her friend something on the screen and laughed. The other woman smiled and shook her head. A few moments later I heard Nicole say, "The hardest part is being patient." Her friend replied with something I could not fully hear. Nicole answered, "Well, eventually it all works itself out." The conversation moved on, but those words stayed with me. Being patient. Eventually it all works itself out. I finished my coffee and left without making my presence known. During the drive home, I kept replaying the moment in my head. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe there was not. What bothered me was not a single sentence. It was how perfectly those comments fit the pattern I had been noticing for months. When I arrived home, I opened the garage and stepped into the familiar silence of my house. The living room looked exactly as it always had. Family photographs lined the shelves. A quilt my mother had made decades earlier rested across the sofa. Everything felt steady and unchanged. Yet I could not ignore the feeling that something beneath the surface had shifted. That evening Ryan called. He wanted to know whether I would be interested in joining him and Nicole for dinner the following week. His tone was unusually cheerful. I agreed. As we talked, he casually mentioned that Nicole had been researching financial planning strategies online. "She is really interested in that kind of stuff lately," he said. I looked out the window toward my backyard. Leaves drifted across the grass in the cool autumn wind. "That is interesting," I replied. Ryan laughed. "She says people make mistakes when they wait too long to organize things." There it was again. Organize, plan, future. The same themes appearing over and over. After the call ended, I walked upstairs and opened a drawer in my bedroom. Inside was a small notebook. Over the previous weeks, I had filled several pages with dates, comments, and observations. Nothing dramatic, nothing outrageous, just facts, patterns, repetitions. I sat on the edge of the bed and added another entry. Then I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. Too many pieces were beginning to fit together. I still did not know exactly what Nicole expected. I still did not know how far her assumptions went. But I was becoming increasingly certain of one thing. She was looking toward a future she believed was already guaranteed. And she had no idea that I had finally started paying attention. By the beginning of November, I had reached a decision. If I wanted answers, I needed to stop observing and start testing. Not in a cruel way, not in a dramatic way. I simply wanted to see how people behaved when they believed an opportunity was within reach. The chance arrived naturally during a family dinner at my house. Ryan and Nicole came over on a cool Friday evening. The meal was simple: baked salmon, roasted vegetables, and a loaf of bread from the bakery near Town Square. We talked about work, holiday plans, and the unusually warm weather forecast for the following week. Everything felt ordinary. Halfway through dinner, I mentioned that I had recently spoken with my financial advisor. The reaction was immediate, although subtle. Nicole looked up from her plate. Ryan paused for a moment before taking another sip of water. I continued speaking calmly. I said that after many years in the same house, I was considering making some changes. Nothing definite, just ideas. Nicole smiled. "What kind of changes?" she asked. I shrugged lightly. I have been thinking about simplifying things. Maybe selling the house someday. Maybe moving some investments around. I am not getting any younger. The room grew noticeably quieter. Nicole set down her fork. "That actually sounds smart," she said. "A lot of people wait too long to make those decisions." There was enthusiasm in her voice that had not been there moments earlier. Ryan nodded in agreement. "You should do whatever makes life easier." I smiled and changed the subject. The rest of the evening passed normally, but I noticed something interesting. Nicole became unusually attentive. She offered to help clear the dishes. She asked whether I needed anything repaired around the house. Before leaving, she even insisted on carrying a box of old decorations from the garage into the storage room. The sudden generosity might have seemed touching to an outside observer. To me, it felt different. It felt strategic. During the following week, the change became even more obvious. Nicole called twice to check on me. She sent articles about retirement communities. She forwarded information about downsizing and financial planning. One afternoon, she stopped by with coffee and pastries without any special occasion. As we sat in the kitchen, she casually asked whether I had made any decisions regarding the house. I told her I was still considering my options. Her disappointment lasted only a second before she covered it with a smile. But I saw it. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subjects: property, investments, future plans. One evening after Nicole left, I sat alone in my living room and looked around the house. The grandfather clock in the corner quietly marked each passing minute. Family photographs lined the shelves. The same photographs I had looked at countless times before. Yet now I viewed them differently. I was no longer focused on memories. I was focused on motives. What surprised me most was how confident Nicole appeared to be. She acted as though events were already moving in a direction she expected, as though she was preparing for a future she believed she understood. The truth was that she knew only a fraction of the story. There were important details she had never asked about, and even more important details I had never volunteered. As the days passed, I continued presenting the same harmless narrative. I was considering changes. I was reviewing options. I was exploring possibilities. Each new hint seemed to draw Nicole in further. And with every conversation, I became more certain that the test was working far better than I had ever imagined. As Thanksgiving approached, Nicole seemed more confident than ever. The small test I had started weeks earlier was producing results I could never have imagined. The more I hinted that major financial decisions might be coming, the more invested she became. It was no longer occasional curiosity. It had become a consistent presence in nearly every interaction. One Tuesday morning, she called before 9 o'clock. After asking about my health, she quickly shifted to discussing real estate. She had found an article about housing prices and wanted to know whether I had spoken to any realtors. I told her I had not made any decisions yet. She sounded disappointed for a brief moment before recovering her cheerful tone. 2 days later, she sent me links to several retirement communities located within 50 miles of town. Some were luxury developments with clubhouses, walking trails, and golf courses. Others offered smaller homes designed for older adults. The message ended with a simple note: "Just thought these might interest you." I thanked her politely. Then I added another entry to my notebook. The following weekend, Ryan and Nicole hosted a family gathering. Nothing formal, just a few relatives, food, and football on television. During the afternoon, I stepped into the kitchen to refill my glass of iced tea. As I approached the doorway, I heard voices from the adjoining breakfast nook. Ryan and Nicole were speaking quietly. I was not trying to listen, but a few words reached me before they noticed I was nearby. "If she sells it," Nicole said, "everything becomes much easier." Ryan responded too softly for me to hear clearly. Then Nicole added, "We just need to be patient." The same word again. Patient. I entered the room, and both of them immediately changed the subject. Nicole smiled and asked whether I wanted another slice of pie. The transition was so quick it almost felt rehearsed. On the drive home that evening, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel before. Sadness. Not because of Nicole, because of Ryan. Each new discovery seemed to place him closer to the center of a situation I desperately wanted him to be separate from. I still hoped he was simply following Nicole's lead. I still hoped he had not fully considered the implications of these conversations. Yet hope was becoming harder to maintain. A few days later, another surprise arrived. Nicole stopped by unexpectedly carrying coffee and a folder. She explained that she had collected information about financial planning services that specialized in helping retirees simplify their assets. She spoke enthusiastically for nearly 20 minutes. As she talked, I noticed something unusual. She was no longer speaking about possibilities. She was speaking as though changes were inevitable, as though my future plans had already been decided and only the details remained. I thanked her for the information and placed the folder on the kitchen counter. After she left, I opened it and carefully reviewed every page. Then I smiled. Nicole believed she was getting closer to something valuable. Ryan appeared to believe the same thing. What neither of them understood was that the future they were imagining existed only in their assumptions. The truth was far more complicated than either of them realized. And very soon, I intended to learn exactly how far those assumptions had gone. The answer began arriving from a direction Nicole never expected. A week before Christmas, I scheduled a meeting with Martin Cole, the attorney who had worked with my husband and me for many years. Martin was one of those people who never rushed a conversation. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, and paid attention to details most people overlooked. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly and invited me to sit down. We spent the first few minutes discussing ordinary matters before I explained everything I had observed during the previous months. The comments, the questions, the sudden interest in my finances, the repeated discussions about property and future plans. Martin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me thoughtfully. "Have you told them anything specific about your estate planning?" he asked. "Very little," I replied. "Most of what they seem to believe comes from assumptions." Martin nodded slowly. Then he opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder. I recognized it immediately. It contained documents my husband and I had created years earlier, documents few people even knew existed. Martin reviewed several pages before placing them on the desk between us. "You remember why these were established?" he said. Of course I remembered. Shortly after my husband retired, we had created a family trust designed to protect assets across future generations. The structure was straightforward, but it contained several provisions that reflected values my husband cared deeply about. Responsibility, integrity, respect. The trust had never been intended as a reward simply for being related to someone. It was intended to support people who acted honorably. Martin pointed to one section and smiled slightly. "Most people never read these clauses carefully," he said. I looked at the page and immediately understood his meaning. Certain behaviors could affect eligibility for future distributions. Attempts to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence financial decisions were specifically addressed. My husband had insisted on including those provisions decades earlier. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Sitting there in Martin's office, I realized he had been remarkably farsighted. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents. By the end of the meeting, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Confidence. Not because I wanted anyone punished. Not because I was planning revenge. Simply because I finally understood the full picture. The future Nicole seemed so certain about existed only in her imagination. The legal reality was entirely different. After leaving Martin's office, I drove home beneath a gray winter sky. Holiday decorations lined the streets. Families hurried through shopping centers, carrying bags and packages. Everything around me seemed festive and ordinary. Yet my perspective had changed. For months, I had been reacting to clues without fully understanding where they might lead. Now I knew. More importantly, I knew something else. If Nicole truly believed she had already secured a place in my financial future, she was making decisions based on information that was incomplete at best. During the days that followed, I continued behaving exactly as I always had. I attended family gatherings. I answered phone calls. I listened carefully. Meanwhile, Nicole appeared increasingly confident. She acted like someone approaching the finish line of a race she believed she had already won. What she did not realize was that the race she imagined was not the one that actually existed. And very soon, circumstances would force that difference into the open. January arrived with unusually cold temperatures and clear skies. The holiday decorations disappeared from front porches, routines returned to normal, and life seemed to settle into its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, something important was approaching. A few days into the new year, I invited Ryan and Nicole to dinner. Nothing about the invitation was unusual. Family dinners had always been part of our lives. When they arrived that evening, Nicole appeared relaxed and confident. Ryan seemed cheerful. We shared a meal, talked about holiday memories, and discussed plans for the coming year. Near the end of dinner, I mentioned that I had recently completed several meetings regarding my financial affairs. The reaction was immediate. Nicole sat a little straighter in her chair. Ryan looked up from his coffee. I continued calmly. I explained that after months of consideration, I had decided it was time to review certain long-term arrangements and make sure everything was properly documented. Nicole smiled. "That sounds responsible," she said. "It must feel good to have everything organized." I nodded. "Actually, there is one more meeting scheduled next week." Neither of them spoke. "Martin will be there," I continued. "I thought it would be helpful for family members to attend and understand how things are structured." For a brief moment, I saw something flash across Nicole's face. Excitement. She hid it quickly, but not quickly enough. During the following week, her behavior changed even more. She called twice asking whether there was anything she should bring to the meeting. She asked whether documents would be discussed. She even asked how long the appointment might last. I answered politely while revealing almost nothing. By the time the day arrived, I felt surprisingly calm. The meeting took place in a conference room at Martin's office. Large windows overlooked the downtown area. Sunlight reflected off nearby buildings and filled the room with a soft glow. Ryan and Nicole arrived a few minutes early. Martin greeted everyone warmly and invited us to sit down. Several folders rested neatly on the table. Nicole's eyes immediately moved toward them. After a few minutes of introductory conversation, Martin began reviewing the purpose of the meeting. He explained that long-term planning often involved legal structures designed to protect both assets and family intentions. Nicole listened attentively. Ryan appeared slightly confused but interested. Then Martin opened one of the folders. He carefully explained how the trust established years earlier functioned. He described responsibilities, conditions, and expectations. At first, Nicole looked pleased. She seemed to assume everything she was hearing confirmed what she already believed. Then Martin reached the provisions most people overlooked. The room grew noticeably quieter. He explained that eligibility for certain future benefits depended not only on family relationships, but also on conduct. Actions intended to pressure, influence, or manipulate financial decisions could affect participation. Respect, honesty, and good faith mattered. I watched Nicole's expression slowly change. The confidence that had followed her for months began to fade. Ryan looked from Martin to me and back again. For the first time, both of them seemed to realize there were details they had never known. Martin continued speaking calmly, reviewing documents that had existed for years. Nothing was new. Nothing had been changed. The only thing changing was their understanding. And as the meeting moved forward, the future Nicole had spent months imagining began quietly slipping away. For several seconds after Martin finished explaining the trust provisions, nobody spoke. The room felt strangely still. Ryan stared at the documents in front of him as though he were seeing them for the first time. Nicole remained perfectly quiet. Her earlier confidence had disappeared. Martin continued reviewing the remaining details in the same calm, professional tone he had used from the beginning. There was no accusation in his voice, no confrontation, just facts, dates, clauses, conditions that had been in place for years. When the meeting ended, Ryan asked a few questions about administrative procedures and future responsibilities. Nicole asked none. She simply listened. As we walked out of the conference room, I noticed something that surprised me. For the first time in months, Nicole seemed uncertain. Not angry, not upset, just uncertain. The assumptions she had relied on no longer matched reality. Over the next several weeks, things changed. The constant questions about my finances stopped. The articles about retirement communities stopped. The suggestions about property sales and investment decisions disappeared almost completely. Conversations returned to ordinary topics: work, weather, family gatherings. On the surface, everything appeared normal again. Yet underneath, something important had shifted. One afternoon, Ryan asked if we could have lunch together. Just the two of us. We met at a small restaurant near the river. After the waiter brought our meals, Ryan looked down at the table for a long moment before speaking. "I think I missed some things," he said quietly. I did not answer immediately. He continued. "Looking back, there were conversations I should have paid more attention to." I nodded. "Sometimes people only see patterns after enough time has passed." Ryan sighed. "I never wanted money to become part of how we viewed family. Neither did I. That was the truth. Throughout this entire experience, the money itself had never been the real issue. The real issue was expectation. Somewhere along the way, assumptions had replaced gratitude. Entitlement had replaced respect. We spent nearly an hour talking. It was one of the most honest conversations we had shared in years. When lunch ended, I felt hopeful for the first time in a long while. Not because everything had been repaired overnight, because recognition is often the first step toward change. As winter slowly gave way to spring, I focused my attention on things that actually mattered. Friends, family members who showed up because they cared, community projects, volunteer work, the life I had spent decades building. The trust remained exactly as it had always been. The documents remained unchanged. The only difference was that everyone now understood them. One evening, months after the meeting, I sat on my back porch watching the sun set beyond the trees. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. I thought about everything that had happened. The questions, the assumptions, the long months of observation. In the end, I realized something simple. Money does not reveal character all by itself. Expectations do. The moment people begin counting what they believe belongs to them, they often reveal what they truly value. I finished my coffee and looked across the quiet backyard. The future felt peaceful again. Not because I had won anything, because the truth no longer needed to hide. And sometimes that is worth far more than money ever could be.